All right, welcome,
Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here.
Julia Torres and Mark Overmeyer.
And we're
Um,
excited today that you're joining us. I know this is an unusual time, but thanks for joining us for this. And we hope that all of your family members and loved ones are healthy and well.
and we hope that this information will be useful. It's just some things that we've been thinking and talking about for a while. And when we were thinking about how to develop something for the Educator Collaborative, we really had the goal in mind of inspiring folks to just think in new ways about things that we already do. So, yeah,
Okay,
without
so I'll
further
start sharing the slides. If you want to start talking a little bit about yourself and how we met, that would be great.
Yeah, so Mark and I met through our affiliation with NCTE and the Colorado Language Arts Society. He was the president at that time, and I was a new teacher, and I came in and he just welcomed me with open arms. And it was so nice to find a home with CLAS, or class as we call it, because everybody in that organization was just so good to me and so welcoming from day one. And we've really just hit it off famously ever since. We go to brunch periodically, and sometimes we go long stints without hanging out, but when we do, it's just a wonderful meeting of the minds. So I'm really excited to be here presenting with my friend. Here we go. All right, so you can see I'm a teacher librarian in Denver Public Schools, a 16-year English language arts teaching veteran. I'm also a librarian for 5 schools in the far northeast region of Denver Public Schools. I am currently the secondary representative at large for NCTE, an EduColor Collective member, so I'm working on behalf of teachers throughout the United States in both of those organizations. And then I'm also the book ambassador with Joelle and McCarthy for the Educator Collaborative. So periodically we'll do fun, energizing book talks and write blog posts about what it means to be a teacher and to live a bookish life. And you can feel free to tag me in anything if you're on Twitter. At Julia Aaron 80 is my Twitter name, or whatever you want to call it. Turning it over to Mark.
And I'm Mark Overmeyer, and excited to be here with Julia. We do go a long way back, so it's so fun to be together with her again. I taught for 20 years in public schools just outside of Denver, Colorado, in Cherry Creek schools, grades 2 through 8. And in my last 9 years there, I was a literacy coordinator. I'm now retired, but I do a lot of writing and thinking and reading about education. I'm an educational consultant now, working all over the country and in different, lucky enough to have been in some international schools as well. And I'm thrilled to be part of as an associate, part of the Educator Collaborative. And I am on Twitter on @MarkOvermeyer, so I'd be happy to hear from you as well. So we're excited you're here today and look forward to learning together. So we'll start with the outcomes. Julie and I wanted to put together some information about textual lineages with you. And so our intended outcomes are that you will understand and be able to cultivate your own literary lineage, and we'll be talking about what that means in the next couple of slides. And the reason we want you to think about this first for yourself is because we think that's the best way for you to think about how you might empower your students to do the same. It's also a way for you to start to think about and problematize your ideas about the literary canon. And we'll be spending quite a bit of time discussing the canon and some problems with sticking with sort of the same text that we've been using for years and years. So we're going to move on now and talk just a little bit about what we mean by textual lineage.
All right, so when we think about textual lineage, we want you to think about your timeline of connecting with literacy. We know that our students connect with literature in a lot of different ways that we did not when we were young, because the forms of literacy that exist now weren't available in the same way. So we want you to just think about some of your earliest memories. And I know I can tell you that one of my very earliest, I went to Montessori school when I was really small. And I remember sitting on a carpet and having alphabet letters that were what we call manipulables, where I could feel them, and I had cursive upper and lowercase letters. And I would put them on a carpet and I was free to just touch them, but also move the letters around, upper and lowercase, in whatever formations I wanted. And that's probably one of my earliest memories with literacy.
So one of my earliest memories of literacy would revolve my grandmother, who lived with us when I was growing up. And from the time I was a very, very young age, we went to the library every Wednesday night near where I grew up in Colorado Springs. And she would check out many, many books, and then I would check out my own. So I'll share a little story about her later on, but she was definitely my earliest memory of a person who had a huge influence on my life with literacy. So.
What is a textual lineage? So when we say textual lineage, we're referring to some work that Alfred Tatum did in Reading for Their Life, which asks us as teachers and to support our students in examining the timeline of literacy encounters and development, but also specific titles, authors, and then the cultural norms, mores, and archetypes that are taught through those stories by those authors. And then also, I love the idea of validating text. So what are the texts that you read that validated or confirmed your ideas about the world and the different understandings that we receive from our elders, parents, etc. There's more additional information in an article called The Textual Lineage of a Teacher that was published by Teaching Tolerance. And Emily Chiariello, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Emily, wrote it in 2014. So there's more information there for you about that actual language of the textual lineage. Mark, I think we can advance slides with the arrow key so that we don't use the mouse. So The Church Mice Spread Their Wings was one of the earliest books that I loved and I remember reading. And I thought it was so funny because if you look in the bottom left corner there, you're gonna see those two mice are showing up at a funeral. And in that moment, everybody thought that they drowned because they went through this adventure where they were in the sewer system. And when they showed up at their own funeral, people thought that they were dead and they were ghosts. And I remember so many funny things in that story, The Church Mice Spread Their Wings. A Whistle for Willie, you'll remember, some of you, first of all, it has a wiener dog in it, and I love wiener dogs. But then also, just the fact that it featured a little black boy, that made it stick in my memory, because most of the books you'll notice on here that I gravitated toward featured animals, because most of the other books featured white children. So you'll see that some of my understandings about the way the world worked, a lot of my understanding actually was formulated by animals. So there you can see, or stories about animals. So you can see Bread and Jam for Francis. I loved those Mr. Tickle and Little Miss Scared or Little Miss Grumpy. I loved all of those books. And what I liked about this Mr. Tickle, because my mom would always tickle me. She would have something called the Tickle Monster. So she would tickle me and I would laugh hysterically. If I was ever sad, she would just tickle me until I would stop. So I loved Mr. Tickle. And then I also loved the Berenstain Bears, all of those Berenstain Bears stories. But again, just understanding that for children of color, often, since we don't see ourselves or didn't see ourselves depicted in realistic ways in a lot of stories, at least not in the early 80s when I was growing up, we gravitated towards stories that featured animals, so, or fantasy or sci-fi. So a lot of my textual lineage involves fantasy stories of daily life, but told with non-white people. And when I was very young, that came in the form of animals. And I'll turn it over to Mark now.
Okay, so on this slide that I'll share with you, I go a little bit older, thinking about what we're thinking about with textual lineages. And as we stated earlier, the purpose of this is for you to think about your own textual lineage. And we just wanted to share some of our own thoughts about that based on our own experience. And then later we'll talk about how your students can do the same. So as I indicated earlier, my grandmother lived with us when I was growing up, and I used to get a lot of books from the children's section of the library until I was about in 6th grade. And that's one day my grandmother handed me To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm one of those rare students, I never read To Kill a Mockingbird for class. I read it because my grandmother put it in my hands. And so it influenced me in a way that I thought about literature could do different things than I thought it could do before. And I have very fond memories of sitting and watching the movie with Gregory Peck with my grandmother on television. Another book when I was in middle school, again, not assigned to me, it was a teacher who recommended I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And even though it's about a girl growing up in Brooklyn, and I had only been in Colorado Springs at that point my whole life, I'd never really traveled. What resonated with me was it was about an adolescent girl, an adolescent who had a problematic relationship with her father, but her father had both good qualities and bad. So it resonated me with that in that sense. Another title that in high school, I had a teacher, we'll talk about the canon later, but I had a really amazing English teacher who, I can't say we did the canon, I suppose we did his canon, but we had an enormous unit on the Black Arts Movement and different poets, and we actually read some poems by Ntozake Shan. So then for Colored Girls, the play for Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, the Broadway play went on tour and came to Denver. And I went to see it. So it had an enormous influence on me about opening up different parts of the world and different thinking and different authors. So I was lucky in high school to have that opportunity to have teachers, even at that time in the 70s, who were introducing me to many diverse texts. Then very quickly, Song of Solomon, I read when I was in college, again, not assigned. None of these books were assigned to me. And I'll say I could go on and on about Toni Morrison, but I won't take the opportunity now. Just an enormous impact on my life as a reader and as a writer. And then finally, I think the first time that I saw myself in a book was not until as a little bit older, in my 20s, was Borrowed Time, which is a memoir by Paul Monette about his lover who was dying of AIDS. And the reason I say it's one of the first times I saw myself, I had read many books, including like Giovanni's Room, that didn't resonate with me as a gay person, but Borrowed Time, because of the love that Paul Monette was sharing, and not just the bad experiences or the negative experiences or the horrible things that can happen if you're growing up gay. I just found it incredibly powerful. And it was the first time for sure, it wasn't until my 20s that I thought, this is really something that I can identify with. So again, we wanted to share our own sort of stories with you so you could possibly think about what are your literary lineages. And I know that as Julie and I talked about this, we have many. This is just a sampling.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about shaking up the canon. So we're going to talk about the works that constitute our canons, and then how you can sort of modify not only your understanding of the canon, because we have this understanding, we are taught as teachers that there is a universal canon. So think about what can you do to expand your understanding of the fact that there are actually several canons. We'll go ahead and move on.
Okay. Sorry about the mix-up with the mouse. I think I finally figured it out. I'm sorry that the mouse has been going over the screen. Okay.
Okay. We got this. So there's Ernest Morel. You may know him. He is a past president of NCTE. And in English teaching, as teaching students to read The Word and the World, which is an article that is in English Journal, I believe, or Council Chronicle. I think it's from Council Chronicle, actually. He says, we want students to engage texts, to interrogate texts, to demand meaning from texts, to talk back to texts, to juxtapose texts with their lived experiences, with their encounters with other texts, and with their rapidly expanding ideas about people and the world. So what we want to do is get students to just live within those texts and to see their lived realities in those texts. That is not possible if the majority or the only texts that you read deal with a lived reality that is so far away from your own. So we bolded those words specifically for us to think about this as an active process, engaging, interrogating, demanding meaning, talking back, and juxtaposing texts. So it's a very interactive experience rather than one where the teacher's telling you what to do and you are complying. We want this to be a reciprocal or interactive experience as much as possible. And we know that's what you want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things to remember is the idea of the canon, that just because you have a particular book that's in your canon or in the canon, my canon may not be your canon. We can learn and appreciate and respect the canon, but we need to include works and authors as part of our students' lived experience. So I know that I shared earlier, as a white male growing up in the 70s in Colorado Springs, when people say, but students have to use the canon, I can't speak for everyone, but all I can tell you is that, as an example, is I never read a Shakespeare play till I was in college. The books that we read in high school, I named a few earlier, but one of the required texts was Johnny Got His Gun, which was incredibly anti-war. Again, I'm not saying this is your experience, but my experience was reading that book did not cause controversy. And I grew up in a military suburb. My dad was a retired World War II vet. And 95% of my friends at least were their dads and some moms were in the military. And there was no issue with that. I remember one of my English teachers, instead of doing a review of a book one time, she said we could go see Apocalypse Now. And so many of us did that. So one thing as I reflect back on some of the teachers I had is that they were sort of allowing us into some of the more different types of books and books that they thought would engage us and not just reverting to the canon. And from my experience, that allowed me to engage more. And I did okay in college. I did struggle a bit through Shakespeare and some of the things that I was introduced to in college as I went through my English degree, but I did just fine. Regardless of what we do, though, Julia makes a good point that this is about empowering students. It's not a one-way street. We have to have students be part of this dialogue. It's about a power struggle if we decide what all the books are, and we need to move beyond, again, that the capital C canon. I read an article in Phi Delta Kappan a few years ago that said since like 1968, there's been like one title that has changed on the most popular books taught in high schools. And that article was published in the like 2012, 2013. And I think that's shameful. We need to, again, empower our students, empower ourselves to find works that do reflect students' lived experiences as well. Okay, Julia?
Yeah, I'll just add that, Chris Emden a while back at NCTE said, you're either going to be able to say, you showed up to work, did the curriculum, and then went home. Or you showed up, did revolutionary work, and made change. That's not a direct quote, but that's essentially what he said. And it stuck with me because we do have that choice all the time to show up and do exactly what we're told, or to ask difficult questions to get folks to question what we are doing and whether it's actually best practice. We always have that option to either push back or to just do as we're told. And school by nature is about compliance. People are rewarded for compliance, adults and students. So we want you to consider the fact that showing up and questioning, pondering, changing, and then working together with students to formulate, as Mark mentioned, your canon, not just the canon with a capital C, because there isn't just one. That is revolutionary work. All right, let's move forward. So that leads us to a collective that I am a part of. Disrupt Text is a Twitter hashtag, a website, lots of PD, and a movement. It is an ideology. It is t-shirts. It is soon to be a book. How do we shake up the canon? Myself, Trisha Abarvia, Dr. Kim Parker, and Lorena Herman have developed Disrupt Text to help folks interrogate their personal biases, decolonize their thinking about what the canon is constructed of, develop a critical consciousness, and then work in community with one another, and specifically with authors and educators of color, to change our ideas about what is worthy of academic study. You can find out more information on disrupttext.org. We did keynote this conference, so feel free to watch that session if you missed it. And then we have a Twitter account that will be rolled out the same day that this EdClab gathering is happening as well. So if you want to follow us there, all day today, anybody who follows has the chance to win some Disrupt Text swag. We'll be picking at random from folks who are following today's EdClab sessions. So what we want you to think about is that, of course, when we're building a literary lineage, you start with yourself. But then there is an adjacent other. So for me, any people of color stories are adjacent to myself, but other. I don't identify right now as Native American. And I'll say that I do have Native American ancestry as far as I know. My mom has shown me a picture of what the urban legend or folklore within the family says that this Native person was part of our bloodline. However, to me, Native American identity is an adjacent other more than something that I specifically identify with. Then there's also a distant other, which in my case would be whiteness, because for me, the lived reality of a white person is so distant and so different a lot of ways from my lived reality that we've got to work to try to find common ground a lot of times. And sometimes those ways that shows up are more obvious and sometimes they are more subtle. So when we think about shaking up the canon, you can start with your own experience of building a textual lineage. But then you branch out into reading books that are about otherness, but that you might identify or connect with. And then a next step is to think about the furthest reality from yourself. And as a person of color in this society, we are usually not given a choice about whether we can learn about the distant other. In my case, we'll look at the most extreme example being Shakespeare. I was not given a choice whether I wanted to understand what it would mean to live in Elizabethan England. That is something that most folks in this country, because it was colonized by England, have decided is something that I have to know. Folks do not decide that everybody in this country uniformly has to learn about James Baldwin. So there's the contrast there. So entering into Disrupt Text is more than wearing a t-shirt. It is really about that interrogation of self, and then the adjacent or proximal otherness, and then the more distant other, and how we can explore those through story, and then also become more, I would say, inclusive and more compassionate, loving, empathetic people, ultimately, by going into doing the act of interrogating, decolonizing, developing consciousness, and then, of course, working in community. All right.
Okay, so Disrupt Text, I can't recommend enough. I do follow Disrupt Text, and they do such great work. So I'm so happy to be presenting with Julia. If you don't know it, I highly recommend it. I was fortunate enough, one of my former administrators became an administrator in Vienna, Austria. And when I was there last year doing some work consulting, a middle school English teacher came up and said, "You're from Denver. Do you happen to know Julia Torres?" And it came from Disrupt Text. So very cool that it's reaching an international audience as well. So one of the ways then we think about shaking up the canon is through the kind of work that Julia was talking about. And the other way we can do this work is being very intentional about increasing our diversity of voices and also genres and texts that we promote. When I mentioned earlier that Phi Delta Kappan article, the one big change that was made in sort of AP Lit or high school curriculums was that there was some, the sort of English teachers felt they had arrived when they included Beloved by Toni Morrison as a text and said, see, we've done it now. So we are increasing the diversity. But what we're talking again is we need to be more revolutionary than that. We need to include a lot of voices, and we also need to think about genres. So that whole idea of what's worthy. So when we think about certain titles, we need to think about graphic novels. We need to think about audiobooks. We need to think about nonfiction text, bilingual text, not just, and books of poetry, not just the same types of books, and not just one fiction book by an author of color and then say we're here, you know, and then assume that we can keep the rest of the capital C canon there. So yeah, so I just wanted to again stress that idea. We want to stress the idea that the diversity comes not just through voices, but through genres. And then Julia's going to give an example of that here with a graphic novel that kind of connects in some ways with the same themes as 1984.
So I book talked Decelerate Blue a while back, and in a presentation for the Educator Collaborative with Joelle and McCarthy. And I'll just say that Decelerate Blue and 1984 and Kindred and the Marrow Thieves could be a text set, or you could do a couple of them together. What I love about Decelerate Blue is that it is essentially, in my opinion, a more fun way to explore the themes in 1984. Yes, we canonize 1984, not only because of the story, but because of how prophetic some of it has turned out to be. But Decelerate Blue, I think, is a really interesting, creative way. The art is great. And there's something to be said for telling a story visually when so many of our students are living in a world that is not just text-based. If you ask any of them, a lot of the way that they learn these days is visual. So we do ourselves and them a favor when we can recognize visual storytelling as a valid and important way to acquire knowledge, to study, to emulate, to use as mentor texts, all of that.
And I think that one way to know more about some of these books, I mean, our readers to not just be the ones who have to know it all. So all of us have students who love to read. And if we're uncertain about certain titles like Decelerate Blue, we have readers right in front of us who are very aware of the kinds of books that are resonating with them right now. And I think that if you've completely avoided graphic novels, I think you're missing out a lot on what's out there. And if we don't know what titles might be powerful, again, I think we can always go to our students. Again, sites like Disrupt Text, other sites that talk about different genres that we can use with our students instead of just sticking with the same type of just fiction, just straight up fiction. Adding these different genres will really help with this process of shaking up the canon. Anything else on that, Julia, before we go on?
I'll just add that I know Trisha Barvia does some cool learning with Kindred, the Octavia Butler's graphic novel, and some other Afrofuturist books, I believe. So she is a teacher that you can look to if you're interested in changing up some ways of looking at dystopia, to not just be a predominantly white dystopia, which is what our students have come to think about when they think about dystopia, specifically because of 1984. And even, I hate to say it, but some of the YA that is dystopian sort of depicts a predominantly white world with the characters of color as kind of a side note or an add-on. But the people who get to do all of the adventurous stuff and be the heroes and heroines are typically white folks. So I would say when you're looking at dystopian books, if you're looking at a dystopia that paints a future that doesn't have people of color centered doing any of the heroic actions, then that might be a red flag for you that you need to keep looking. So I'll just add that. All right, this is a list of these are some books that Mark and I have used in our work with students. I can speak specifically to Passing by Nella Larson. That one stuck with me, and a lot of students that I teach like it because they are multi-ethnic or multiracial. And the idea of someone being able to acquire power by passing for white, and then what that does to them to be adjacent to whiteness, that's something that we don't often talk about in schools because a lot of folks don't understand it. So I loved teaching Passing by Nella Larson. And then I can say I'm very excited to be able to teach and work with Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds. That one came out last month. And there is a teaching guide by Sonia Cherry Paul that School Library Journal has published. And then I have a little guide for librarians that was put out through School Library Connection. So those two things can support folks in teaching and working with that book. I will say what I love about Stamped is that it is a nonfiction text that has elements of poetry and fiction in it. So you'll enjoy that because it can be both a mentor text for studying literacy and writing, but then also it supports that idea of what some folks call revisionist history, or just really getting the full picture of history, not just a partial picture. And Passing does that as well. Salvage the Bones and Sing Unburied Sing. I know those have been adopted into the curriculum in several districts, which I'm really excited about. Jessamine Ward is my birthday buddy. We have the same birthday. And I will say that those books are ones that you can and should read over and over again. Powerful, powerful works. And they're recently published.
And one thing that I can say also about the advantage to someone like Jacqueline Woodson, talk about someone who has already created a textual lineage from picture books all the way up to books for adults. So one thing that's great about Jacqueline Woodson is, as you think about students over time, they might, some of the students in front of you right now may have been introduced to Jacqueline Woodson picture books when they were a bit younger. And then she's got middle grade novels, and she has novels for adults. And Brown Girl Dreaming is a classic now for upper elementary into middle school. And her most recent book, I believe, Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, is Red at the Bone. And again, what a great, just a lineage that someone is writing across those different age groups, which is highly unusual. Jason Reynolds was another person who does some of that work, who co-wrote Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You with Ibram Kendi. So even thinking about, you may know this writer from your younger years, and then we can introduce new titles to them as they get older.
It isn't listed here, but I'll say David Bowles wrote, I want to say it's Feather-Hearted Serpent. I'm not sure about the rest of the title, so I don't want to say. I think it's Of the Sky. But David Bowles is another author that you can look to who writes across age groups and has a lot of essays online that you should read that are phenomenal. Isabel Quintero also writes picture books and YA. So when we prepared this list, we really were just going off of what we have taught and used with students. But you need to prepare your own list, because a lot of folks just go off of lists created by other people and don't do that work of building and working with and gaining experience with titles on their own lists. So I cannot say that enough, that it's very important to work with your students to build a customized list of what you think is awesome, appropriate, expansive, necessary for folks in your community to read and explore in order to have an expansive, inclusive list of titles.
Okay, so the last thing we'd like to chat about a little bit is having students become creators of their own textual lineages in different ways. And again, the way that the reason to do this is because we can empower them. It's not just about us choosing, it's about us using them as understanding that they can empower themselves to create textual lineages and even start to write their own. So one thing that we have to remember is that as creators of texts, students are the most confident they can be. It's the most empowering thing we can do, is to have them create. So in this sense, we're talking about not just reading and creating textual lineages for themselves, about books where they see themselves and books where they broaden their understanding of the world, but it allows them to write their own. They can see that I can do this work as well. So one of the enormous benefits of having students be exposed to writers that they can completely embrace and identify with, is they can see themselves as writers of those texts. That's why someone like Jason Reynolds is so powerful, because he's a Black male writer who is doing all this work and these incredible books. But when he goes into schools, he's like a rock star, and students who were not previously engaged in literacy may see themselves in him and decide, maybe I can do that as well. So it's a way to self-express. It's even a window to healing. And it also expands their ideas of, hey, I can do this too. I could be a writer. I could create texts. If we only go to the consumer side, we're only having them externalize this instead of internalizing how amazing they can be and how their stories are also important.
I'll add that, again, going back to what we said about cultural capital, there are many cultural capitals that you may not have because they don't belong to your culture. So it's good for us to consider and think about cultural capital that belongs to cultures other than our own. A long time ago, I did a workshop about teaching about East Asia. And as part of that, I learned about a writer named Sei Shonagon. I had never heard of Sei Shonagon. Sei Shonagon was writing, I believe, about the same time Shakespeare was. But she wrote a book called The Pillow Book, which talked all about the intricacies of court life from a feminist perspective in, you could call it feudal Japan, or an era in Japanese history where a lot of stories were told via these screens that they would put around the insides of their rooms. So typically we think about the fact that art is created by ordinary people and it captures what is going on in their world at certain times. We don't want students to believe that the only people who can capture truth about what's going on in the world are those who are older than they are, those who have all these degrees, those who are more refined. We want them to understand that they themselves can be observers and creators of art from whatever time period or geographic location they happen to be in. And we also, I think as educators, tend to bring books into the classroom where we can be the experts. So then the students become dependent on us as the primary source of knowledge about how to interpret a text, what an author means, and then it becomes an elaborate game. Some of the biggest complaints I've heard from folks throughout the years about language arts class is that they feel like decoding literature is a game, and the teacher has already mastered the game and is sort of wanting everyone else to march to the beat of their drum, to repeat back or parrot back to them the right answer about what it means to be, for example, a character in The Crucible. And so it's really important that we strike a better balance between being the sole source of knowledge in the classroom and being a facilitator to students being curious and developing knowledge about texts. And perhaps we can put ourselves in the place of being a student. Paulo Freire talks a lot about when the teacher becomes the student and the student becomes a teacher, what a powerful moment that can be. So we want our students to understand that the process is reciprocal. And I think now that we are in these strange times of coronavirus, where we are isolated from one another and we don't have that same proximity to our students that we used to have, this is a perfect time for our students to be able to explore, for us to set up systems that will encourage them to be curious. And then also, I know that the Library of Congress and Jason Reynolds have teamed up together to release writing prompts. I think they're bi-weekly writing prompts so that we can bring creative writing back into language arts classrooms. There has been an overemphasis from my perspective on argumentative writing. And though that is important, the essay, I am a big fan of the essay. I love the essay. Roxane Gay's essays thrill me. I love them. But I can tell you that I think we have let our enjoyment of writing or writing for pleasure, I think we've kind of let that fall by the wayside a bit. So this is an opportunity to get some of that back, which is exciting. That brings us to abolitionist teaching. What does it mean to be an abolitionist teacher? In Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, she talks a lot about how our present day school system is one that basically mimics the incarceration system or the American injustice system. There are a lot of injustices committed against our students, and it's unfortunate, but also it's intentional that we have created a system where students do feel like prisoners to a large extent. So how do we get over that? Her book is phenomenal, so highly recommend it. Also, Goldie Muhammad has a book called Cultivating Genius, which if you have not read it or heard about it, you need to fix that. She says, as long as oppression is present, students need space to name, interrogate, resist, agitate, and work towards social change. Reading can be a work of agitation, shaking up the system. So can writing. And so that's what's really important about her book, is that she looks at the genius present within specifically Black history, and says that our students do not always need to look externally to examples of white excellence to understand how to be great, because that greatness is already within them. It's a beautiful book. And then, of course, I always go back, always return to Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. So how do we practice education? And she and Paulo Freire were contemporaries. They did know each other, which was something that I learned through reading that book. How do we exercise education as a practice of freedom rather than one of incarceration or encouraging compliant people? So if we want students to value and prize our cultural canon, then we're not actually working toward them building their own, which is really important. And then, of course, in order to be truly free, we got to create, learn to value excellence in our own traditions, stories, and notable figures. So we have to find them. I have had to do a lot of work as a Black woman in this society to try to find people from my past that I was not taught about in school. I didn't learn about Assata Shakur until I was an adult, which is a shame. So yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
And I think, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. All of these books were written by people who succeeded, who we would say are successes, that their works are successful. They succeeded despite, or perhaps to spite, the inequities in the system that was not built for them to succeed. So you can look at the stickers on the cover. I was privileged to be able to hear Tommy Orange speak at NCTE. And he talked about how school was not for him. And some of our most creative students are actually disenfranchised by the school system and very put off by moves that we make as teachers. So I think we can look to these 4 texts, but also many more, to see these are examples of people who thrived. And I'm sure that they had a teacher, 2, 3, 4, who believed in them and encouraged them and saw in them what many others didn't. But imagine if that was the norm rather than the exception.
And I think I'd just like to add too that it's up to all of us to do this work. I think I've been in systems myself in the past where some of us expected teachers of color to do this work for us or not to be as informed. And I think all of us, white educators, all educators, need to inform ourselves, need to empower our students, because this is all of our work. And so it's our job. It's not just other people's job to make sure that this kind of work can happen, that other titles are surfaced as very worthy and worthy of study. All of us can start. And again, my feeling is that there's no excuse at all now. There's so many titles out there. There's so many incredible books out there. I've read all 4 of these titles, and every one of them, I wish I could redo some of my work that I did with either middle school or when I taught middle school. Some of these books would have been incredibly transformative for many of my students. So it's up to all of us to do this work. So just to kind of think about a process as we finish up here. So one thing we're suggesting then is you might first think about analyzing and discussing a textual lineage for yourself as a way to have students do the same for themselves. You might share your own thinking about a textual lineage, share your own story through books that meant something to you, and then have students do that same type of work for themselves. Just that sort of empowering of, I'm sharing this with you because I want to know the same from you about your life. So the first thing that we suggest is that you think of your own textual lineage, do some work yourself, and then be ready to think about what you might do with your students. And then you can move to sort of reimagining the canon together with your students, not putting it all on you. And Julia, other thoughts on that?
Once you've looked at your textual lineage, perhaps you can identify some areas for growth. So identify how, if the majority of the books that shape your textual lineage deal with your own identity, then just visually or mentally go back to that disrupt text slide and think about proximal otherness and then distant otherness, and how you can start to read texts that will take you further and further away from yourself. Some of us wind up doing the majority of that as adults, which is unfortunate, but we can support our students in not having to wait until they're adults to do that. That's when we do the work of reimagining the canon. So we ask our students to do the work of thinking about their textual lineage. Then we identify as a class, what are some areas for growth? What are some identities that are missing from your canon of books that you consider to be your favorite? I bet we're gonna have many students connecting with manga and Naruto and saying that they love Naruto. So ignoring manga is probably not a good idea. If that's shaping the lived reality or experience of our students, then we need to think about why that is. And then lastly, we empower students to become creators or to find the creator that already exists within themselves. So how can we work with our students throughout the continuum to understand that writing can be a healing experience? Creative writing, not just argumentative writing or writing to analyze somebody else's work.
And finally, a quick thought on this idea of empowering students is the reason we want to have so many different types of texts and so many different voices is they can find their own mentors. When you're a writer, any writer you read about their process, they all have writers who they admire, who they study their texts and imagine themselves creating texts like that. And that's another reason that we want to make sure that we really open up what we want students to read and allow for a lot of diversity in both voices and genre.
All right, so if you have any additional questions, you can always at me. I will try my very best to respond. You can always email me. Please don't email my dpsk12.net account. I think that that's circulating out there. I don't check it very frequently, so please reach out to me via this Gmail address. And of course, I didn't put it on here, but the Educator Collaborative has a button on my page for Ask a Book Ambassador. So you can reach out to myself or Joella McCarthy that way if you have questions about books, and we're always happy to respond.
And please feel free to do the same for me. My email is on here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or continue the conversation. And I want to thank Julia for this opportunity. It's been a great way to spend some of the time together. It reunited me with Julia and thinking about things that I love the most. So it's been an awesome opportunity, and we hope that you gain some things from it to continue your thinking about your work with students and yourself.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This was a blast. We always love being able to talk about things that we love, and we're here for you. If you have any questions or want any further discussion about any of this, please reach out.
Bye-bye.
Bye.